She was the kind of teenage girl who loved makeup tutorials, danced with friends, and posted light-hearted videos on TikTok. But then, in the middle of an ordinary weekday night, an unimaginable tragedy struck when her parents were suddenly found murdered in their bed. With a story this awful, the world grieved alongside this newly orphaned girl, especially when she decided to take to TikTok to share her heartbreak. But behind the facade of this grief-struck teenager, something much more sinister was at play, and as the weeks passed by, a darker question slowly began to creep in. So, were these the genuine cries of a daughter in mourning, or was this the carefully staged performance of someone with something to hide? Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're diving into the ongoing and controversial case of Sarah Grace Patrick, a story that has left many people divided. And I know this story's been getting a lot of coverage recently, but today we'll be drawing on everything we know about the case so far, probably with some info that you've never heard of before. By the way, if you aren't subscribed yet, then please consider doing so. Not only do I post up to twice a week here, but you'll be joining 2.1 million other people, and Nero would really appreciate it. And now, with all of that out the way, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Sarah Grace Patrick. Welcome to Georgia, folks. In today's story, we're traveling to the small city of Carrollton, which sits around 75 kilometers or 45 miles west of Atlanta. Now, Georgia is often regarded as part of the Deep South and home to more than 11 million people. Historically, the state thrived on agriculture. However, in more recent decades, huge companies like Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, and Home Depot have all set up their headquarters in Atlanta. This, of course, brings much-needed wealth into the region. And, sadly, with wealth, inevitably comes greed. From the 1980s right through to the early 2000s, Atlanta consistently ranked among the top 5 most crime-ridden cities in the entire of the United States. Now, thankfully, in the years that followed, a massive turn-up in investment would actually lead to a huge turnaround. And by the year 2015, Atlanta had slipped all the way down to 19th place on that list, which sounds like great progress, and in many respects it is. However, when you turn the lens onto homicide, the story unfortunately changes quite dramatically. In fact, over the past 15 years alone, Atlanta's homicide rate has almost tripled. So, while murder is still relatively quite rare here, when police received a phone call at 7:15 in the morning on February the 20th, 2025, they quite naturally took it very seriously. The voice on the other end of the line was a young girl who was only barely able to form her words through tears, desperately fighting to describe what was going on inside her family's home. The caller was 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, and it turns out that only moments earlier, her 5-year-old sister Jaylee had run to her bedroom after making a horrifying discovery. And that's because, after waking up just a little bit earlier, she had walked into her parents' bedroom to find both of them lying unresponsive in their bed. When officers arrived, they took both Sarah and Jaylee, who are now in great distress, away for professional care. Meanwhile, police stepped inside to investigate. Now, at first glance, nothing seemed out of place. In fact, the entire home seemed to be spotless. And not only were there no signs of forced entry, but nothing seemed to be damaged either. But by the time officers reached upstairs, well, that painted a very different picture. And although the children's bedrooms were tidy, the master bedroom held some very dark secrets. After stepping through the doorway and then peering into the bed, officers found both Kristen and James cold to the touch. And although at first glance it looked as if they were merely just sleeping, that is when they looked closer. The pillows and bedsheets were just covered in blood, and both adults seemed to have injuries with what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds. Now, what is quite interesting here is that police were almost immediately able to determine that, due to the angles of the projectiles, these injuries were not self-inflicted. This of course meaning that neither of the two were responsible for either of their deaths. Unfortunately, both Kristen and James were pronounced dead at the scene, and officers were also able to determine that, due to the state of their bodies, they had likely died a few hours prior, well before the girls woke up from their sleep. Oh, and just a quick side note here for clarity, but the son was actually away from the family that night, meaning there were only 4 people in the property at the time. And now, with 3 newly orphaned children and 2 adults murdered in their own bed, police now had the grim task of trying to figure out what precisely happened. After taking an initial look at the crime scene, detectives realized that the house itself told a very curious story. Every room, apart from the master bedroom, was immaculate as always. The home was clean, tidy, and nothing appeared to be out of place. And not only were there no signs of a struggle or any forced entry, but nothing from the property had been stolen either. With this in mind, it basically ruled out any sort of possibility of a robbery gone wrong. And why in that scenario would they creep upstairs, only to murder a sleeping couple before then failing to ransack the house? None of this made any sense to police officers, and to be honest, it didn't to me either. Detectives now believed that whoever had pulled the trigger that night had the sole intention to murder both Kristen and James. But to make matters even more confusing, another crucial detail quickly became apparent. No murder weapon was ever found at the crime scene, which only made the investigation even more difficult to solve. As you can see here from Google Maps, the Nolan family lived in a rural and heavily wooded area. Their neighbors were far and few between, which only made it even more unlikely that surveillance footage recovered from their properties could help. In the days that followed, police combed the property, searching for the faintest trace of forensic evidence. Meanwhile, the extended family announced a $5,000 reward for anyone with any information that could help lead to an arrest. But before we go any further in this story, it is worth asking, who precisely were the Nolan family? Did the family have any enemies? And if not, were they targeted by anyone from the outside? Well, to begin with, the family included both parents, Kristen and James Brock, and their 3 children, including 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, her younger brother Donnie, and her younger sister 5-year-old Jaylee. Together, they lived on a rural property in Carrollton, Georgia, surrounded by many fields and trees and on a beautiful stretch of land. To make things just a little more complicated, Sarah and Donnie were from Christian's first marriage to Doniel Patrick, a turbulent relationship that sadly would end in divorce in July of 2018. And as is often the case, custody would soon become the central battle between the two. Although both parents would fight for full rights, the court ultimately ruled for joint custody, with Christian holding primary care, while Doniel was unfortunately left with quite the rough deal. Sadly, he was only allowed to see them on alternate weekends and holidays, a decision that would leave him with only fleeting time with his children. It was soon after this that Christian met James Brock. A hurricane romance followed, with both of them quickly falling in love and moving in together. Now, naturally, James stepped up into the role of stepfather, and thankfully, he did seem to be good at it too. And when Kristen and James later welcomed their daughter Jaylee to the family, it finally felt complete. Moving forward, the Brocks became a familiar part of their community, with thanks to attending Carrollton's Catalyst Church nearby. While James was the natural joker of the group, Kristen was both bubbly, warm, and nurturing. And from local news reports, it looks like that their children were well liked by neighbors and the community too. So, as you can see, on the surface, the Nolans looked like a happy, faith-driven family from the Deep South. But in truth, the reality was actually far more complicated. It turns out that James and Kristen were both former addicts, with things getting so bad at one point that they both got in trouble with the law. Kristen had struggled with a serious drug problem, which actually was one of the biggest reasons behind her split with Doniel. Side note, but it's also the main reason why he fought for custody. And while little is known about Doniel himself, it isn't difficult to understand his concern. He believed that Kristen's drug use posed a real risk to both Sarah and Donnie's upbringing, and it turns out that court documents would also reveal that James Brock battled with the very same demons. However, this was not the same story that the Patrick family shared. They claimed that their renewed faith and their bond with each other had become a new way of turning the page. They were determined to put those dark days behind them, and at least on the surface, it certainly looked like it. But the thing is that Daniel was not actually convinced himself, and he believed that Kristen and James were putting on this facade simply to try to keep social services away. He was quite terrified actually, because his version of reality was very different, and he believed that his children were frequently exposed to both meth and weed in the family home. And when his son Donnie showed up with a mark on his body and claimed that James had hit him with a belt, well, that was the breaking point for him. No surprise, he went to social services that very same day and demanded that they revisit their custody rulings. It was only 2 days before Christmas in 2019 that he filed an emergency motion. In this document, he claimed that not only did both of his children look neglected, but they were also behind on medical and dental care. And the thing is that he was not the only one who was sounding the alarm, because even his daughter, Sarah, who was only 11 years old at the time, wrote in her own statement that she would prefer to live with her father. Sarah would also later tell her teacher that she was actually afraid to go home. Worried for her safety, the police then became involved, and she would tell them the exact same thing. In fact, she would even describe to them the drug packaging that she had found around the house, and even the smell of meth. I mean, doing drugs as a parent is bad enough, but doing them in front of your own kids is a whole new level of neglect and cruelty. Sarah quite obviously knew that something was wrong, but her younger brother and sister were far too young to understand, especially Jaylee. So in a way, it was kind of up to her to sound the alarm to teachers and officers. It really shouldn't be that way, but nobody else was going to do it. Now, unfortunately, the courts did not grant Daniel full custody, but his emergency filing did seem to win him some time, that being sentimental custody of 4 days over Christmas. And as more of their history came to light, things only seemed to look worse for Kristen and James. It was in this moment that social services discovered that James already had a record. They learned that he was arrested in 2017 for meth possession and then sentenced to probation, where he then violated it a year later with a string of other charges, including shoplifting, stolen property, weed possession, and obstructing an officer. That little crime spree would earn him even more probation and jail time. And obviously, it was hardly the picture of a dependable stepfather. The evidence against Kristen and James was clearly stacking up, and by October of 2020, the courts had finally changed their arrangements. From that point onwards, both Sarah and Donnie would live with their father during the weekdays and only see Kristen on certain weekends. And it wasn't full custody, but for Daniel, it was a big step in the right direction. That being, in his mind, giving his children a safer and more stable home. However, the custody fight was not the end of their issues, because in December of 2022, tragedy struck Kristen and James yet again, but in a very different way. Sadly, James had suddenly suffered a massive heart attack, and doctors also realized that he was now in advanced heart failure. They also claimed that if he didn't have surgery immediately, he wouldn't survive. Now, thankfully, he would survive, but that was only after surgeons installed a left ventricular assist device, which is basically a mechanical pump that helps pump blood through the body. Now, you're gonna have to trust me with this, but all of this ties back into the investigation. The long story short is that James's pump had a monitor that he would carry around with him at all times of the day. If anything was out of rhythm with his heart, it would play an extremely loud alarm. And let's just say that those preventative measures are extremely foolproof. Now, despite all of their past struggles, by early 2023, things did genuinely appear to be improving for both Kristen and James. I mean, even the once bitter relationship between Kristen and Daniel had now seemed to mellow out. Believe it or not, but all three parents were even seen together at some of the kids' events, sitting down in the same room without any issue and even chatting casually. So, with everything going so well for the family, what happened on the night that two of them were murdered? On the surface, Kristen and James didn't seem to have any enemies whatsoever, at least not in recent years. So, unless some ghost from their drug-fueled past came back to haunt them, then it was kind of hard to imagine anyone wanting to wish them harm. But behind the polished family image, cracks were slowly forming. For example, maybe Kristen and James were now each other's worst enemies. It is known that around a year before their wedding in 2022, things did take a dark turn when James actually petitioned the court for a protective order against his very own fiancée. James claimed that he feared for his and his daughter's safety. It was during one explosive argument that apparently Kristen got into the family car with Jaylee and Donnie still inside and then tried to run him over while he was stood in the barn. He also claimed that apparently Kristen had been hitting him regularly, destroying property, and even threatening to kill him. He also suspected that she had swapped hard drugs for prescription abuse. However, here is the strange part. James would later decide to drop every allegation. And so, the protective order against his fiancée never went through, and within months, they went ahead and even married in December of 2023. So, did Kristen change for the better, or did James just simply bury it all for the sake of the family? Even more curiously, did this have anything to do with their deaths, or is it simply just another tragic backstory? Well, what we do know based off of the bullet trajectories is that neither of the two were responsible. The evidence proved that neither Christian or James turned the gun on themselves and then each other, which of course means that somebody else is responsible. But who? And why? Unfortunately, the crime scene offered no answers either. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, and both of their exes were accounted for that night. So, with nothing pointing to an outsider, officers were now forced to turn their gaze inwards to the only other people in the home. I can't believe we're talking about kids here, but Donnie was with his father that night, which of course meant there was only two other people. There was young Jaylee and 16-year-old Sarah, and when investigators looked closer, they realized that Sarah's story did not seem to add up. As days turned into weeks with no arrest whatsoever, the community rallied together around these three children. However, things were happening in the background, and in public, especially with, hello, the true crime community, people started to look closer into the case, and let's just say that things were not quite adding up for Sarah. Like many other children her age, Sarah was chronically online, and basically had profiles absolutely everywhere. She was on Instagram, on Facebook, but her favorite platform by far was TikTok. And let's just say that in the weeks following her parents' murders, she would begin to post a lot of things on that platform. Now, to be fair to her, there is no rulebook with how to process grief. We all do that very differently, and I can imagine that losing your parents this suddenly would be absolutely awful. However, given the circumstances, some of Sarah's online activity would be classed as weird to most people, and it wasn't long before viewers and even some members of her own family started to raise questions. Now, before we look at TikTok, let's rewind to her first Facebook post. Since Sarah's phone had been taken by police as evidence, she actually logged into her dad's account to write this message only 4 days after the murders. In this post, she described being woken up by her sister screaming and then discovering her parents after they had been shot. She also claimed that some of the details in the news were not actually accurate, although she didn't specify which parts. She also wrote that she was praying for the person who had killed her parents and thanked her church for keeping her family in their prayers. A few weeks later, a funeral service was held at Catalyst Church. Sarah stood before hundreds of people with a eulogy, with the entire moment being captured on video.
We can't always choose the music the life plays for us, but you can choose how we dance to it.
And you can see that towards the end, and while still crying, she weakly said, "I'm sorry."
Jamie and Mama would have thanked y'all too. I love you guys, and so do they. I'm sorry.
What she meant by that apology is not clear. Perhaps she felt embarrassed for breaking down in front of everyone. Or maybe it was something deeper. Whatever the reason, it did seem to stick in people's minds. And trust me, it would come back later, as questions about Sarah would only grow louder. In the weeks that followed, Sarah would continue to post on social media, but mostly on TikTok. By late March, and about a month after the murders, she would even let people know through her dad's Facebook account that TikTok was where she would be sharing all updates, and in an attempt to increase her following, asked them to follow her over there. Now, by the time that I'm telling you this story, her TikTok account has been completely wiped clean, probably on the advice from her attorneys. But the thing is that the internet never forgets, and enough of her videos were later saved and then re-uploaded. And let's just say that it no longer looks great for Sarah. In one video, Sarah filmed herself in tears with mascara streaking down her face. The clip is paired with a trending sound, and over it she had written, "They don't know it, but a year from now, me and my 5-year-old sister would find them wrongfully shot dead in our home, and they won't get to see me graduate, walk down the aisle, or even say goodbye." The video then shifted to a slideshow of happy family photos. But what really struck people as odd was that the video opened with a photo of Sarah all dressed up as if she were heading to a party, before then cutting to the memorial images. Many viewers felt it was both jarring and tone-deaf, which, to be honest, yeah, it is. I think we're all tired of seeing insecure people claw for validation. In another video, Sarah claimed that she felt crushing guilt, saying, "I can't help but hate myself because I didn't wake up before my 5-year-old sister had to find them like that." And in another, she said, "It hits me when I hear her screaming for her mummy and daddy." These were raw, heartbreaking admissions, and the kind of pain that you would expect from a traumatized teen. But seeing it broadcasted to the world like this only fueled the split reaction, with sympathy being felt on one side and suspicion on the other. But Sarah was not merely posting on her account either, because by June of 2025, and only a few months after the murders, she had even contacted a TikTok true crime creator named Allegedly Apparently, specifically asking them to cover her parents' case. And this is where it gets even more suspicious, because Sarah would describe her parents' murders as, quote, a big hit, and even offered, quote, insider intel. Now, the creator did end up making a video about the case, and Sarah was seen interacting in the comments. Again, this would fuel a whole bunch of mixed reactions, because some would see this as her trying to keep the case in the spotlight, but others believed that this now basically crossed into spectacle. Either way, Sarah's social media left many people divided. And so, on that note, what do you think at this stage? Was she a grieving teenager desperately seeking justice, or was this something else entirely? One thing was certain here, that Sarah absolutely adored her mother, and nearly every post circled back to how much she missed Kristen. For many weeks, her grief was raw and relatable. But by early summer, the tone did seem to begin to shift. What once looked like a daughter's heartbreak now started to feel performative. And one of the main questions that many people asked when they looked at Sarah was wondering if she was simply grieving, or if she was now enjoying the attention that tragedy had brought. And it wasn't just the internet that was asking that question either, because by now, even law enforcement had started to quietly scrutinize her. And then came July of 2025, when all of a sudden the case was flipped on its head. Despite numerous months of hard work, detectives had no evidence to suggest any attack coming from the outside. And so, with that in mind, they now had to question the unthinkable. Of course, that being, were they perhaps murdered from someone on the inside of the property? So, out of the family of 5, who could potentially be responsible here? Well, to begin with, there's James and Kristen, but they were the 2 that were actually murdered, so definitely not them. Next, there was Donnie, but he was out of the property all night. And then there was Jaylee, but she was 5 years old at the time. And that only leaves one person remaining. Of course, the one who called emergency services, the one who apparently slept through the gunfire and James's alarm, and if you look closer, the one who potentially has both motive and opportunity. And of course, I'm talking about Sarah. By early July, detectives believed that they had enough to incriminate Sarah, and so they issued a warrant. And by July the 8th, she was officially within police custody. The community was absolutely stunned. Her involvement sounded like, well, the kind of drama you'd find on an episode of Coffeehouse crime. However, investigators themselves were confident in their theory, and so, later that day, the sheriff's office announced her arrest. They claimed that there were mountains of evidence available, backed by interviews with the FBI. Because this is still an active case, police have not shared much of what they actually have on Sarah yet. And so, for now, we're left piecing things together from the little that we do actually know. But let's just say that even in this limited position, many details simply don't sit right. First off, let's talk about the front door. Not only do investigators state that there was no forced entry, but everything seemed to be intact. The only odd thing was that one of the doors was actually left ajar that morning, which of course could mean it was staged to suggest a break-in, or also could just simply be how the family lived. It is true that they resided in a safe neighborhood with pets, and so leaving a door unlocked overnight was not unthinkable. But when you pair that with 0 foreign fingerprints or any DNA whatsoever, and the mystery intruder theory suddenly looks quite flimsy. And then there was the crime scene itself. The house was spotless, nothing was stolen or disturbed, and whoever did this seemingly went straight upstairs, shot 2 people multiple times, and then just simply walked out, apparently. That's not your average burglary gone wrong here. Whoever had murdered them, well, it was personal. And finally, let's look at Sarah's story. She told the police that apparently she went to bed around midnight, not even saying goodnight to her mother or stepdad, which her relatives claim was unusual. She also told the officers that she slept throughout the entire thing. Of course, that means that she would have slept through all of the commotion and even the gunshots, only waking up when her younger sister Jaylee came crying in the next morning. However, here is where it starts to unravel, because on social media, Sarah actually said something different. In one of her videos on TikTok, she actually claimed that she had in fact heard her dad's heart alarm around 20 minutes after going to bed, and that apparently it was so loud that she could hear it over the TV. The video suggests that even if she wasn't responsible for her parents' murders, she was still awake while all of this was going on, which included the gunshots. So, not only do we have 2 conflicting stories from Sarah, but also one of them makes no sense whatsoever. She would have had to hear the alarm, the gunshots, all this commotion with some intruder coming up the stairs and into her parents' bedroom, and somehow just been okay with it. And also, her sister Jaylee claimed that she heard those gunshots in the middle of the night. Apparently, they were distinct loud booms. And of course, if Sarah would have heard that, she would have likely jumped out of bed to investigate. However, in her police interview, Sarah claimed that she heard absolutely nothing at all, which of course now punches a huge hole in her credibility. So, the investigators were now left with a weak alibi, a door left ajar, no sign or evidence of a break-in or anyone coming from the outside, and a teenager whose story keeps shifting. Have to say, not looking good for Sarah, is it? By now, it wasn't just the internet or the police who were growing suspicious of Sarah, but her very own family. The most vocal about it was James's niece, Kristen Dowder. Not only had she been close to her uncle, but she had also known Sarah ever since she was little. She had always adored her. Of course, that was only until the arrest, and after that, Kristen did not hold back. When she herself began to grow doubtful, she posted Sarah's eulogy on Facebook with a brutal caption, saying, "After their funeral, and when I saw someone had recorded this, I immediately saved it because I knew that, one day, everyone would see it for what it was. I sat there at the service thinking, am I actually watching the person who murdered them stand up here in front of everyone, fake crying about them? Does anyone else notice she's doing a crying voice but never actually sheds a tear? This is what a monster looks like. Monsters do come in the form of sweet-looking girls in pretty dresses sometimes. And luckily, in this case, that monster gets to trade her dress for a jumpsuit and handcuffs. Kristen is convinced that something is off about Sarah, and it wasn't just the family who thought the eulogy was odd either, because even detectives noted the same thing. In fact, law enforcement even saved a copy of the funeral live stream as evidence. They also believe that Sarah's public display was less about grief and more about controlling suspicion. But remember, at this point, most of the evidence still remains a secret. Prosecutors say that they're holding back the full picture for trial, but insist that their case is strong. I mean, they wouldn't charge a 17-year-old with double homicide on mere speculation alone. But curiously enough, they've also said that further arrests are maybe possible. When Sarah turned herself in, she was hit with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. And because of the severity of this case, the state plans to try her as an adult. This means that, if she is convicted, she'll face life behind bars. After Sarah's arrest, even the true crime community weighed in. That is when allegedly, reportedly, also revealed that Sarah herself had asked to cover her parents' murders.
So not only did this teenager ask me to cover a case that she would wind up being arrested in, but her comments on that video that I made that she requested are so disturbing to look at now. Sarah Grace has now been arrested and charged with taking her mother and stepfather's life. She requested that I make a video about it, and then she commented, "Thank you for spreading awareness." She also replied to this person who asked what was used in this crime, and she answered. This person commented and said, "From an investigative standpoint, it would seem that it was someone who knew them, hoping for answers and swift justice. Sarah Grace, the daughter and stepdaughter of these victims who has now been arrested, said most definitely was, since they knew the house."
It was clear that TikTok had become Sarah's outlet for grief, but whether that grief was real or staged, that's still up for debate. Her quick jump onto trending sounds and dramatic posts had left many wondering if she was actually chasing sympathy or simply chasing views. However, while most of the internet has turned their back on Sarah, she still does have several loyal supporters. Of course, the biggest one being her own father, Daniel, who claims that she is absolutely innocent. As of the time making this video, he still hosts fundraisers, posts interviews, and basically says the same thing over and over again, that Sarah is a sweet and gentle and kind-hearted girl, and there is no way that she could be responsible for all of this. I'm not surprised given the state this world is in, but there is even a Facebook group that seeks to defend Sarah, which at this point in time has already gained over 1,000 members. Even still, alongside that support, even darker rumors are circulating online. Several of her friends on TikTok claim that Sarah had previously been hospitalized for mental health reasons, though so far none of them have been confirmed. And let's be honest here, literally nothing on TikTok can be taken seriously. Despite her apparent involvement, no real motive has emerged so far. For now, Sarah is sitting in jail. Her bond hearing was on August the 19th of this year, where she asked to be released and live with her father until trial, but thankfully that motion was denied.
On a motion for bond, defense has a burden of coming forward initially with evidence to show that the defendant does not pose a significant risk of fleeing, threatening the community, committing another crime, or intimidating a witness. And then it is the state has the burden of persuasion in convincing this court that the defendant is not entitled to pretrial release. I believe those closest, and I say closest, in family relationship expressed that they had vast concerns that she would have the ability to flee, that she would be a danger to the community, that she would be a danger to them, and that she would pose a significant risk of intimidating, or actually I think the state steered away from intimidating, or influencing or manipulating witnesses. By finding that, I find the state has met their burden today by preponderance of the evidence. Ms. Patrick, because of that, I'm bound by the law, and I do not believe that you would be a proper candidate for bond at this time.
As a result, she will remain behind bars at least until the end of her trial, which could be months away or maybe even years. That all depends on how strong the evidence really is. Hopefully, as time goes on, more light will be shed on this case, and you can absolutely bet that whenever we find more updates, I'll let you know in the future. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on this one, and probably losing sleep on it too. Unfortunately, we are ending this video on a rather open-ended cliffhanger, but of course, all of the evidence so far does seem to suggest that Sarah is responsible for her parents' murders. There is a lot to chew on here, and honestly, I've seen so many theories and opinions that I don't really know what to believe anymore. But what do you think? Do you think Sarah is responsible for her parents' murders? Or do you think she was unfortunately framed? As always, please share your own thoughts in the comment section down below, and I'll try to read as many as I can. And hey, if you haven't subscribed yet and you're not part of the Coffeehouse crime community, then please do consider doing so. It really does help the channel out. Alternatively, if you want to do something a little more casual, please find me on Instagram. I mean, just saying, if you want to see more of Nero, that is definitely the place to go. Anyway folks, with that said, thank you so much for watching today, and I really appreciate you making it to the end here. I'll see you again very soon for another video, probably in 4 or 5 days, we'll see. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.